All right, so it is an honor to have back on the set this week one of our favorite attorneys here in South Carolina, Lauren Taylor from Lauren Taylor Law. And for those of you who are new to FITSNews coverage of the Murdaugh saga, Lauren was absolutely indispensable last January during the big evidentiary hearing, which really has set the stage for a lot of what we're going to talk about today as we deal with the recent arrest of Becky Hill, the former clerk of Colleton County, who was responsible allegedly for tampering with the jury that found Alec Murdaugh guilty of the murder of his wife and son back in the summer of 2021. Lauren, I got to ask you, when we were breaking down this case last January and you went through all of those court rulings that were so central to the notion of jury tampering and which standard would be used and how the court might interpret the arguments that were made, obviously Alec Murdaugh came up short on his first bid for a new trial. But as we look at the developments now with Becky Hill and her arrest, I got to ask you, let's start with this baseline question before we dive into all the details. Is Alec Murdaugh going to get a new trial? Are you at 50% yes, 75% yes, or are you all the way 100% at this point?
You know, that's the question that if I had a lottery ticket and I knew the answer, I'd be a very wealthy woman. I think it's still developing, but I definitely think the chances have gone up substantially since yesterday's developments. While they are loosely related to the Murdaugh murder trial, they're not all related to that. So I think that's an important distinction. So right now, Ms. Hill is looking at, I believe, a total of 4 charges, one of which is the perjury charge, which actually stemmed from that January hearing last year where Justice Toll asked her if she had made sealed evidence available to any members of the press. On the record, she answered no. That was then found to be untrue based on some evidence that had been made part of the record a year before. The next charge is obstruction of justice. There's several elements to that charge. Some are common law. Basically, it can amount to several things and what she's doing within the scope of her duties as the clerk of court. So obviously writing a book and profiting off of it and using, knowledge or information that she might not have otherwise had, minus her position as being the clerk of court. That's something that could be seen as obstructing justice. And then there's the other 2 charges, which are a little bit more alarming, I think, to those of us who were really solely focused on Ms. Hill under the Murdaugh scope. These relate to mismanagement and misfeasance of public funding. So there were some federal grants that were awarded to Colleton County specifically, and it appears from the context of the warrants that were released yesterday that they're alleging that Ms. Hill, I believe it was like $9,800 for one of them that she personally benefited from. And then there was another $2,000 transaction that was cut for her personally, Becky Hill, from the clerk of court's active account. So I think, we're obviously hearing statements from all of the attorneys that were on the first case and some attorneys that are representing the jurors that are involved here. My biggest red flag with all of this, and I think, I've made my opinions clear that I thought there was enough back in January of last year to warrant a second trial. But when you're looking at someone who has the power that a clerk of court does, now a lot of us have only been exposed to her in this sense of a murder trial. She has so many more duties that are unrelated to trying murder cases. There are family court cases that go through the clerk of court's office. There's child support obligations, DSS hearings, criminal cases, bond cases, passports. There's a lot of money that goes through that office, and there's a lot of responsibility that's put on that elected official. So if she is tampering with that, and these warrants list passport offices, things like that, my argument is going to be this woman has been using her position of power, an elected position at that, to have her way with this small town courthouse. And if that's the case, my biggest concern isn't how she answered Judge Toll's questions back in January of last year. It comes back to the egg juror. So if she is, getting her hands in all of these pots and, creating these issues from the beginning, even before Murdaugh case was happening, then what's to stop her from, tampering with a potential juror on the day that deliberation is about to start because she has some feeling that that juror may or may not vote in the way that she wants them to. And I think the Supreme Court is going to have to really look at that. And I believe Joe McCullough is the one that is representing the egg juror So that's going to be, at least an argument that if I was Dick, I would be bringing that up. It's a difference if the juror had never been excused and we call all those jurors back in and they all give that same testimony, minus juror Z, I believe, that did say, I was impacted by Ms. Hill's statements to me. So if we take all that in and all those jurors still, render that verdict of saying, no, it was harmless contact, I was not affected, it did not sway my verdict, that's irrelevant when we now add in the fact that there was one person who was sat on that jury, questioned by the judge, selected by the defense and the prosecution, and but for Ms. Hill, possibly was not allowed to enter that jury room and render a verdict.
Well, you mentioned the egg juror a moment ago, and specifically that theory that she had been targeted because she was a holdout, because she wouldn't secretly tell the clerk of court that she was a guilty vote. That's exactly what she's alleged in her book, Myra Crosby, the egg juror. In fact, she specifically claimed that there was a broader conspiracy to target her because they had basically sussed out that she was undecided. And so the fact that there are potential jury rigging allegations here, in addition to the jury tampering, which was documented in that hearing. But Lauren, let me ask you this question. Are you surprised that in these 4 charges against Becky Hill, there's nothing related to jury tampering?
I think it's a delicate question because we only had one juror that answered, in the affirmative that the statement, well, I think there was one other one that did say the statement was made, but she answered that it did not affect her verdict. So in that sense, there might just be a little bit more digging to do. Also, keep in mind that if you're the state and you're arguing, to the Supreme Court that this was a fair trial, this was harmless contact, there is absolutely no need to put the state and the taxpayers through the need to retry this case, you're not going to want to roll out charges of jury tampering against your clerk of court because it kind of cuts your nose off to spite your face a little bit when you're saying, hey, everything was great. We're not even charging her for any of this harmless contact, which I think is the crux that Judge Toll leaned on, during her determination and what the case law dictates. Now that we have this whole other can of worms opened, it's going to make their position in that argument a little bit more difficult. South Carolina hated how much attention this case got on a national level. No one, including all of the Supreme Court justices, want to try this case again. However, I think, I get questions all the time from people that are like, well, he's spending the rest of his life in federal prison. What is the difference? Why do we care? Well, unfortunately, Dick gave a great interview when he was talking about his book that I personally loved. And I've had this question before, guilty people need legal representation. And it's really important in this state, whether you're someone that's as famous or infamous as Alex Murdaugh, that you have the same rights as everyone else. And, whether he's guilty of a financial crime is a very different thing than whether he's guilty of the murder of his wife and his son. And I think, in the legal community, up until Alex took the stand, there was still a good chatter among us that this could be a hung jury, or at the very least, it could be a mistrial. A lot of the evidence, I think, overwhelmed jurors. It was a little confusing at times. A lot of it came in later than they were expecting, and they didn't have the full amount of time they would have liked to have really put together some compelling visuals, specifically with the car data. I think that lost some jurors a little bit along the way. But to me, once I sat down and understood it, that was almost as much of a nail in the coffin as the video from Paul's phone. But I think, with all of that, no one wants to redo this. But it almost has to be done when you have someone that is an elected official that is putting her fingers into things that are constitutionally protected rights.
Exactly, and you mentioned it earlier, Alex Murdaugh's right to Sixth Amendment protection is the same as yours or mine or anyone out there. And we've consistently argued here at FITSNews anyway, that once you determine that his Sixth Amendment rights were violated during the trial, at that point, that's the ball game. And I felt after that evidentiary hearing last January that bar, which was set by Justice Toll, former Chief Justice Toll, a very high bar, which a lot of folks even argued she set the bar too high. But I felt at that hearing that they cleared it, Lauren. But let me ask you this. You mentioned that, Becky Hill, none of these charges are necessarily related to the jury tampering. And so it feels like prosecutors and investigators are trying to keep the inquiry focused on things that don't involve the verdict. But let me ask you this. How does a prosecutor stand up and argue that Becky Hill should be taken at her word that she didn't tamper when they are prosecuting her for perjury on another matter? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I would not want to be the one that has to make that argument. I think it goes to the truth of the matter. You know, if you will lie on a televised evidentiary hearing that is conducted by the former Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, you can't tell me you're not going to tell a lie behind a closed door when you don't think anyone's listening. And I think that's going to be what the state is going to have to inevitably, you know, we'll see what the strategy is that they develop. I'm sure they'll get crafty with it, but I would not be the one or be wanting to be the one to make that argument in front of a judge. I think it's full of obvious holes.
Well, there's so many loose ends here to this story. Obviously, the Becky Hill component of it. We've seen some charges. That investigation is ongoing. We don't know whether there will be additional charges. We've also got the case of Curtis Eddie Smith hanging out there, Alec Murdaugh's drug dealer, allegedly, his check casher, allegedly. Charges against him just sort of hanging out there. No one really knows what to expect of that case, where it's going. But also we've got other elements of Alec Murdaugh's appeal. In fact, he's challenging some of the phone data which forms the basis for the state's timeline. They're basically saying that evidence and testimony that was admitted, which helped law enforcement and prosecutors establish that timeline for Alec Murdaugh's guilt, they're now saying that that's out of the window based on the arguments made in the appeal. Is all of this, though, basically a jury tampering issue, though, Lauren, or do you feel that some of the other elements of Murdaugh's appeal could potentially tilt the scale toward a new trial?
You know, I think Judge Newman was really great in really taking the time to consider what evidence he was going to allow in. He knew that this case was going to be ripe for an appeal regardless of the outcome, likely. So I don't know that it's so much of an evidentiary issue, but the defense is absolutely going to hang their hat on the Becky Hill thing and use whatever they can to essentially get a new slate, right? Because at that point, they can remake motion arguments for motions in limine to exclude certain evidence. I think in a second trial, it's typically easier for the prosecution going forward because they kind of already have an idea of what the defense's strategy is going to be. Now, I would suggest that the defense take a different strategy in the second trial, meaning I would not, you know, if he was my client, I would certainly not encourage Mr. Murdaugh to take the stand. And if he doesn't, I think that is going to make things a lot more difficult for the state to prove. I think that the case was not, you know, locked and thrown away before Alec Murdaugh took the stand. I think, you know, to some degree, he had a major part in the verdict, and that was through his testimony. So if that does not happen, I think the state is going to have an uphill battle, which is really not normal. Usually the state is always at a better advantage knowing, you know, what loopholes they missed the first time or what witnesses maybe didn't get the evidence across in the way they wanted to. They have time to go back and prep that witness, get their exhibits in a better way. And keep in mind, this case is so massive. And the way Creighton Waters had to tie it all together, you can't leave out the financial part of it because that's the motive to the murder. And so there has to be enough of a story told that doesn't confuse the jurors, doesn't bore them, and is easy to understand to put all into this picture. And I still think that the average person, even after hearing all of that evidence and having it presented in the best way, we struggle, can a man murder his wife and his son? And that is still going to be in the minds of every juror if we do have a second trial. So I think the strategy from both sides is going to be very different. And we might even see some new lawyers at play on both sides. We'll see.
When you mentioned the decision by Alec Murdaugh to take the stand, I thought it was very telling during the first trial when Attorney Jim Griffin, the way that he phrased it, he didn't say the defense calls Alec Murdaugh. He said that the defendant wishes to take the stand. It was pretty clear that he was advised not to do that by his counsel. He did it anyway, ended up backfiring pretty spectacularly. And you mentioned Creighton Waters a moment ago. What a masterful job he did. Some say the financial component of it was belabored a bit, but this is a guy who literally stuck the landing on a very difficult case. Lauren, what kind of pressure is he facing to stick the landing if we got to do this a second time? Is it something you can duplicate?
It's absolutely something you can duplicate, because I think, a lot of Creighton's success was in his passion, right? And when he just straight up called him a family annihilator, like, let's get to the point of this, because all these jurors are sitting here thinking that no person would murder their family. And when we get to the heart of it, he needs to paint Alex Murdaugh as a desperate, drug-addicted sociopath who is willing to do whatever needs to be done to meet the end. That is what he needs to get out of whatever lie he's told now. So I think that is going to be the heart of it. Now, when Alec took the stand and, kind of gave the jurors the show that Creighton had been painting the picture of, that made Creighton's job a little bit easier. I think he could kind of kick his feet back and be like, see, I told you, like, he's lying to you guys right now. Without that, it's going to be a lot more of playing on the jurors' emotions. Can you get them over that finish line to where they see that gun in his hand, they see how the night went, and they can, go to sleep at night and know that they convicted a man who did in fact commit the crime.
When you mentioned Dick Harpootlian earlier in the interview, we obviously sat down with him earlier this month. He was extremely optimistic that the state Supreme Court was going to award Alec Murdaugh a new trial. In fact, he then subsequently gave an interview with Seton Tucker over Impact of Influence, even more bullish on the prospect for his client Alec Murdaugh to receive a new trial. But let me ask you this, Lauren, assuming Murdaugh is unsuccessful before the South Carolina State Supreme Court, which I think is still a possibility. As you mentioned, a lot of folks just want this to go away in the South Carolina legal community. It's been a huge black eye for South Carolina's attorneys, for the justice system. A lot of folks want it to go away. But assuming the Supreme Court doesn't give him a new trial, Murdaugh still has a very viable avenue to pursue at the federal level. Isn't that correct?
Yes, he does. And I mean, that could still render the same situation here. So I think the state issue is where, Dick is going to say it's got to happen. It's got to happen. That's what, he gets paid to do. So I think that they are definitely using the embarrassment of this case and the embarrassment that Becky Hill has brought not only upon her office, but upon our state as further leverage. And I think they're going to get that leverage a lot easier through the South Carolina State Supreme Court than they would taking the federal level. So I would see a lot of steam slow down once South Carolina Supreme Court has made their decision, if they do decide to deny the retrial request. I think they'll still pursue it on the federal basis, but I think their best shot right now is kind of using the outrage and, all of this stuff to fuel their argument. And I think that's much more impactful on the state level than it would be in the federal level.
Well, we are still without a timetable at the state level. The Murdaugh appeal was filed back in December. We are still waiting for the state of South Carolina to respond. They have requested not one, but two extensions on their response to Murdaugh's appeal. In fact, Murdaugh's attorneys have called them out for stalling on the case. And Attorney Joe McCulloch, you mentioned him earlier, he's even been more aggressive, calling out SLED's investigation, saying that it is essentially an effort to protect this verdict as opposed to find the truth related to this saga. But Lauren, when we do get a hearing on this, I hope you will join us. I hope you'll be out front of the courthouse with us again, because we were dealing with some incredibly tricky issues last time, and the way you broke down those different cases and what the standards were really helped our audience understand what was going on and exactly what Justice Stoll was looking at in that hearing. Would you be willing to join us when that?
Oh, happy to help. Happy to help. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting day in the state. Wouldn't miss it.
Well, we've talked a lot about Murdaugh, but obviously you're tracking a ton of other cases, not just here in South Carolina, but across the country. Tell us a little bit about some of the cases that you've been watching lately, Lauren, and what you're seeing in some of those other big true crime dramas across America.
Right. Yeah. So I think everyone, whether you want to be following it or not, is catching some glimpse of the Diddy trial right now. I think, for a lot of people, it's difficult to consume what is coming out as a result of this trial. So just to give like a very generic recap, Diddy has been charged with several crimes, one of which is sex trafficking, one of which is the transportation of a person with hopes to commit prostitution, which sounds a lot like sex trafficking. And he's also been charged with racketeering. So racketeering carries up to a life sentence potentially, and then each of those other charges can carry up to 15 years each. So what we've been seeing coming out in this trial so far is some pretty disturbing testimony. The first witness was a male escort who was having relations with Mr. Combs, as well as Cassie Ventura. And then the second witness, which has been Miss Ventura herself, Cassie. She's very heavily pregnant. I believe she is about 2 weeks away from her due date. And the testimony that she is giving is, to put it lightly, nauseating and gut-wrenching. The big thing that I'm seeing a lot online is there's a lot of comments from people thinking Ms. Ventura should have left. Why would she stay with someone for 10 years that is, abusing her and conducting himself in this way? And I think that is the defense's strategy here, right? They want to paint this case as it's simply a domestic violence situation. This couple, while they're sexual preferences may be considered deviant to some, this is what two consenting adults chose to participate in, and it does not, meet the elements of trafficking. So what we're seeing today, and actually in the following rest of this week, is the judge has actually allowed the jury and I believe some participants in the courtroom to watch some of the videos that were obtained from Diddy's residences. Now, these videos are extremely explicit. The rumors are that they involve many celebrities, many people that are probably not going to love this being shown. And I'm getting a lot of questions from other, legal people in the world kind of saying, what is the strategy behind the prosecution showing such vulgar material to the jury? And I think without seeing it, obviously, we have to kind of think back to the elements of proving a trafficking charge, right? So Cassie was under the age of 18 when she first met Diddy. So that is one of the elements if someone is under the age. Any kind of extortion or, she's made the claim that he's told her he would remove funding from her album. She would, no longer be able to make music or be blackballed from the industry. So those are the things she's getting out in her testimony that are meeting those elements. But what's going to be shown on those videos, I think, is going to be indisputable proof of either drugs or substances being ingested unknowingly. And then those parties that have ingested substances are now being forced to engage in acts that they wouldn't normally participate in. And those acts are now being filmed, which can later be used as blackmail against them. So once that's all shown to the jury, I think they're going to really have a much more complete picture of this was not something that took place between just one couple. And, even if they were quote unquote poly or swingers, it wasn't something that these parties were engaging in of free will. And that's going to be what needs to happen. Now, it's worth noting that Diddy did reject a plea offer in this case. So, when you choose to go to trial and you know that this evidence is going to come up, my only thought for his rationale behind that is that he wants to bring everybody else down with him. And this is kind of his last stage publicly to do that. So it's going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, the rejection of the plea and proceeding with this, knowing that all these videos are going to come out, knowing that all of these accounts of these deviant parties are going to come out. The theory that he is trying to bring other folks down with him, Lauren, is that something that you feel is credible? Is that a allegation that you think resonates? Do you think he is trying to bring other celebrities down with him?
Well, you can never get into the mind of a criminal defendant, right? He's been in jail now for, I believe, the last 6 months. He's not in a nice prison. He's not having a great experience there. I believe his lawyers have made several motions to try to get him removed to a better facility. You don't know what a desperate person will do in certain situations. But I think it's important to note that his two teenage daughters have been in attendance every day except for yesterday. His sons are there. His mother is there. So, normal people would want to shield their loved ones from some of this information, you would think. So, I'm not a psychiatrist or, a mental health professional, but you would think either he's not of right mind, and his argument is going to be these tapes aren't me, or they're fabricated in some way, or AI. I'm sure the government has plenty of arguments, prepared if that is something the defense brings up. But yeah, I mean, he probably is thinking, I got away with this for so long, and all of these people participated with me. It's not just me. So if I'm going down, everyone's going down with me. And Jay-Z was brought in originally through the attorney that kind of gathered the class action suit, but I believe at this point he's been dismissed. But there's a lot of celebrities that are on the list to testify. So once those videos are shown, I think the news cycle is going to start getting a little crazier on this one.
Do you think it'll end up being bigger than OJ?
Well, no one died. Well, I mean, actually, there are some rumors that he's involved in several mysterious deaths. It's definitely bigger than Murdaugh. We won't be able to watch the Bronco chase in this one, but I think it's definitely pulling back the lid on things that have been going on in the public and with very rich and influential people, and it's more important than ever to protect those people. A lot of people online are saying, why didn't Cassie leave? Where could she go? The chief of police is friends with Diddy. He was at his house for some parties. The night of the hotel incident, the security guard at the hotel incident came to the room, saw her in the corner. He's going to testify as well. Saw bruises on her, clearly saw her trying to leave. He saw the video. There were so many things. And even in Cannes, I believe he, hit her in the face and caused like a lesion in her face. And he promptly took her to a plastic surgeon to have it repaired. And then she was on the red carpet a week later with him. So the woman did try to leave, and she made every reasonable effort. I think it's beyond a normal person's comprehension to think what you would do in a situation like that with someone that has unlimited resources, unlimited connections, and unlimited power, especially when she was 16, I believe, when she first met him. So it's really important to keep all of that in perspective. And she did get away. She's married to a personal trainer now that Diddy had hired for her, and he helped her get out of that situation. And they have 2 children already, and they're expecting their third any moment. She will likely give birth during the course of this trial.
Lauren, you said something a moment ago that kind of stuck in my head. You said you never know what desperate people might do. And I think you said that in the context of Diddy, but let me ask you this. All these folks who are now potentially exposed, all of these folks who now may potentially find themselves linked to this ring of deviant behavior, what might those desperate people do? And we mentioned OJ a moment ago. Now I want to think about a parallel to another name, Epstein. Is Diddy at risk?
I think that I would be worried if I was him. I think he's got a lot more people that are upset with him than Epstein did, probably, just from, feuds he's had for years in the rap industry and everything else. And now this has put, a huge target on his head. As far as the other people, I'm sure that there have been frantic calls made to lawyers, frantic statements sent out, frantic cease and desist and threats of injunctions. I'm sure all of that is happening. As far as what they're successfully able to prevent him from sharing, who knows? He's got his life on the line right now, and he's going forward with this trial. So it's going to come out. It's just in what form is the public going to be able to see it?
Well, I can't wait to get you back on to talk about that trial as it unfolds, and obviously the Murdaugh trial. Any other cases you're tracking, Lauren, that our audience would be interested in?
I'm not just a true crime nerd, I swear, but I think everybody is following Karen Reed right now. And that case is really, it gives me Murdaugh vibes as far as how in-depth and intricate it is woven. Anyone that's followed it from the first trial, she's currently in the middle of her second trial. And that is a case out of Boston. So if you haven't been following it, it's a little too convoluted to just do something short on, but hopefully I'll have a little bit more as the trial progresses. They've already picked a jury, and it is going forward with the second trial. So hopefully in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we might have a resolution on Karen Reed as well.
Well, I don't know how you do it all. I got to say, it's amazing how you kind of link in the in-depth legal analysis of these complicated cases with motions that go into all sorts of intricate case law You weave that in with just sort of the real world ramifications of it and what people are talking about. I love this analysis. And also, Lauren, I got to say, the one thing I truly love about your analysis, it is right down the middle. You don't pick teams, you don't play favorites, you call it like you see it. And that is very rare in this true crime genre in which we are operating. But really glad to have you back. We've been missing your analysis. Great to get you back in here, and I hope you'll be a regular as this Murdaugh saga clearly beginning to escalate.
Thank you so much, Will. Always happy to be here.